He handed her the papers on a Tuesday morning, the same morning she'd made his coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, left on the corner of his desk before he even came downstairs. Nora Whitfield Crane didn't cry right away. She stood in the kitchen of the house they'd built together in Oakville, Ontario, the one with the bay window that caught the afternoon light just so, and she read every page. Carefully, the way her mother had taught her to read anything important, slowly, with both hands holding the paper flat so it couldn't shake. The divorce was clean, her husband's lawyer had written. Straightforward, an amicable separation. Nora had almost laughed at that word. Amicable, because Elliot Thorne hadn't looked amicable when he'd slid the envelope across the kitchen island. He'd looked relieved. She'd known something was wrong for almost a year. You always know, she thought later, sitting alone in her car in the driveway, because she couldn't figure out where else to go. You know the way you know when a song is about to end. Something shifts, the rhythm changes, and then it just stops. Elliot was 38, the CFO of a mid-sized logistics firm in Toronto, and he'd been handsome in the way that men like him often were, polished, composed, the kind of man who knew how to order wine at a restaurant and make everyone at the table feel they were in good hands. Nora had loved that about him once, the steadiness, the certainty. What she hadn't known, what she only found out later, after a colleague called her with a strange, fumbling apology, was that the steadiness had been directed elsewhere, for 14 months, toward a woman named Cassandra, who worked on the 4th floor of his building, and who had, apparently, been very patient. Nora was 36 years old. She'd spent 9 years building a life she'd believed in. She signed the papers that same afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the coffee she'd made for him growing cold on the counter beside her. She didn't ask for very much. The house had his name on the mortgage. Most of the savings had been redirected into accounts she hadn't known about. Her lawyer, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Lamb who operated out of a small office in Burlington, had told her plainly that she had grounds to push harder. Nora hadn't pushed. She'd been too tired, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion was something she couldn't quite name yet. A shame that didn't belong to her but had settled on her anyway. She signed. She walked out. She drove to her sister's apartment in Hamilton and sat on the bathroom floor for approximately 25 minutes. And then she got up, washed her face, and ate half a grilled cheese sandwich because her sister, Trish, had made it and stood in the doorway looking worried. "You don't have to be okay," Trish said. "I know," Nora said, and she took another bite. She was not okay. But she had a remarkable talent, always had, for functioning while not being okay. She went back to work at the urban planning firm, where she'd spent the last 7 years. She answered emails. She reviewed zoning documents. She sat in meetings and contributed reasonable, considered opinions about transit corridors and green space allocations. She went home to the apartment she rented in Mississauga, small and bright and smelling faintly of paint from the previous tenant, and she ate dinner alone and sometimes cried a little and sometimes didn't, and slowly the weeks began to pass. She didn't tell anyone she was pregnant until she was 11 weeks along. She hadn't planned to keep it secret. She'd taken the test on a Sunday evening in October, sitting on the edge of the bathtub in her small apartment, and she'd held the result in her hands for a long time without thinking very much at all. The pregnancy had existed in some quiet corner of her body during all those weeks of paperwork and logistics and grief. She'd known it in the way she sometimes knew things before she knew them. The timing wasn't kind. She was newly single, renting an apartment, freshly unmoored from the life she'd expected to live. She was 36. She was, by most conventional metrics, not supposed to be doing this alone. She decided to do it anyway. The decision didn't feel brave, particularly. It felt like the only thing that made sense. This small, stubborn, already existing life. She wasn't ready to let go of another one. Trish cried when Nora told her. Their mother, who lived in Guelph and had opinions, cried in a different way. The kind that contained several unspoken sentences about timing and responsibility and what will people think. Then she drove to Mississauga the following Saturday with 2 bags of groceries and a hand-knitted blanket she'd apparently had waiting in a drawer, and she didn't say any of the unspoken sentences at all. Nora didn't tell Elliot. She knew she should. There would come a time when she'd have to. But every time she picked up her phone to text him, she thought about the way he'd looked handing her those papers. That particular expression, relief dressed up as regret, and she'd set the phone back down. She told herself she would tell him when she was ready. When the ground felt a little more solid beneath her feet. Then things stopped being quiet. It started with a message from her colleague, Dev, who had heard through someone at Elliot's firm that Elliot was being investigated. Nora had absorbed this information without reacting, thanked Dev, and gone back to her desk. But the next morning there was a voicemail from Patricia Lamb, her lawyer, asking Nora to call when she had a moment. What Patricia had to tell her was careful and measured and took a long time to say simply. The firm where Elliot worked had flagged a series of irregular transactions going back almost 2 years. Internal accounts had been manipulated. Signatures had been forged, digitally, cleanly, the kind of thing that took either considerable technical skill or considerable access. Elliot's name was on all of it. Elliot maintained he had no idea. He hired a criminal lawyer immediately. He told his firm he had been framed. And Nora, sitting in Patricia's small Burlington office with her coat still on because she'd been cold for weeks, found herself feeling something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the particular weariness of a person watching a very predictable story end the way it was always going to end. Does this affect anything? Legally? For me? She asked. Patricia had paused. That depends, she said slowly, on a few things. Then Patricia asked about the baby. Nora hadn't mentioned the baby to Patricia. She wasn't sure why she was surprised that Patricia knew. Small legal community. Trish had told their mother. Their mother had apparently told her book club. News moved. You may want to consider, Patricia said, what rights Mr. Thorne might seek to claim. Nora drove home through November rain on the 403, both hands on the wheel, and didn't let herself think about it until she was safely parked in her spot outside the apartment building. Then she sat there in the dark for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, and she thought very carefully about the question. Patricia hadn't asked out loud, but had placed carefully in the room between them. She thought about Elliot's expression on that Tuesday morning. She thought about the way he'd never once, in 9 years, asked her whether she wanted children. Not as a real question. It had been more like a topic he kept rescheduling. Not yet, maybe in a few years. Let's wait until the finances are sorted. She'd been patient. She'd believed him. She'd had no idea that while she was being patient, he was being something else entirely. She thought about the apartment she was living in, and the baby that was growing without asking anyone's permission, and the cold and steady fact that she was completely, comprehensively on her own. Then she drove inside and made dinner and went to bed. The person who changed things was not who she would have expected. His name was Fletcher Beaumont. Not the kind of name that arrived quietly, Trish had said when Nora mentioned it, and Nora had given her sister a long look over their mother's kitchen table. He was 43, the CEO of Beaumont Infrastructure Partners, which operated out of Calgary but had offices in Toronto and Vancouver, and 3 other cities Nora couldn't remember off the top of her head. He was the kind of businessman whose name appeared occasionally in financial coverage, though not in the way that attracted photographers. More the kind that showed up in serious reporting about urban development contracts and public-private partnerships. Nora knew who he was because he was the lead investor on a transit-adjacent development project her firm had been brought in to consult on. She'd seen his name on briefing documents. She'd sat across from his project director in a boardroom in downtown Toronto and discussed transit buffers and community impact assessments and land use compatibility. She had not expected to meet him in person at a site walk in December, nor had she expected him to be the kind of man who actually showed up to site walks, or who asked the right questions, or who stood in the cold on an undeveloped lot in Etobicoke and listened to her explain the grade concerns with what appeared to be genuine interest. Most executives send someone, she said, not meaning to say it out loud. I know, he said. I used to. I found I missed things that mattered. She looked at him sideways. He wasn't performing thoughtfulness. She'd worked around enough of that to recognize it. He meant it. They talked for 20 minutes longer than the agenda required. His project director eventually made a quiet, significant look at his watch, and Fletcher, Mr. Beaumont, she corrected herself, had thanked her for her time and shaken her hand with the practiced firmness of someone who'd been shaking hands since he was 22. She thought about it on the drive back. She didn't know what she thought about. He called her office the following week, not to discuss the project. His assistant called first, then transferred, and she found herself somewhat unprepared for the directness of it. He was in Toronto for 3 days, he said, and if she wasn't otherwise engaged, he'd like to continue the conversation from the site walk over dinner. She almost said no. She was 5 months pregnant. She was in the middle of a quietly catastrophic year. She had sensible reasons to say no that had nothing to do with him. She said yes. She told him about the pregnancy at dinner, because it seemed dishonest not to, and because by then her coat was off and the fact of it was fairly visible. She watched his face for the reaction most men produced, the fractional recalibration, the barely detectable shift, and found instead something that looked remarkably like straightforward respect. "That takes considerable nerve," he said. "Doing it on your own." "I'm not sure it's nerve," she said. "I just couldn't imagine the alternative." He nodded. He didn't push for more. He asked about the project instead, and then about her background, and then about a transit project she'd worked on in 2019 that he'd apparently read about in a municipal planning journal. And she found herself talking for longer than she'd talked to anyone in months. Not about the divorce or the pregnancy or the complicated tangle of her current life, but about work, about ideas, about the specific way cities grow and fail and grow again. She drove home and sat in her car again, a habit she was developing, apparently, and felt for the first time in a long time something that wasn't grief or exhaustion. She wasn't sure it had a name yet. She filed it away carefully. Fletcher was in Toronto again in January, and then in February he called between visits, not often enough to feel obligating, but consistently enough to feel intentional. He asked how she was and seemed to mean it as a real question. He sent, once, a book about urban design she'd mentioned offhandedly wanting to read, with a note on a plain card that said only, "I thought you'd find the 3rd chapter interesting." She did. She did not tell him she was struggling. She was struggling. The winter had been hard, the particular hardness of pregnancy alone, of nights that were too quiet, of a body doing something enormous without anyone to witness it. Trish was there as much as she could be, but Trish had 2 children of her own and a job that was demanding. Their mother drove out on Saturdays when the roads were good. There were prenatal appointments she attended alone, and sat in waiting rooms alone, and read old magazines alone. And she had decided that this was simply what her life looked like now, and she would not spend energy resenting it. What she hadn't told anyone, not Trish, not her mother, not Patricia Lamb, was that Elliot had reached out. He'd called twice and texted once, all in the same week in January. Nora had stared at the notifications and felt something cold and careful settle in her chest. She knew Patricia needed to know. She knew this was the thing that had been coming. The moment where what had been quiet became complicated. She called Patricia the next morning. What Patricia told her was thorough and unhurried, in the way that Patricia always was. Elliot's situation at the firm had deteriorated significantly. The investigation had expanded. There was credible evidence, according to contacts Patricia had at the edges of it, that the manipulation of the accounts had involved access that was not Elliot's alone. That someone else, possibly someone very close to the operation, had used his credentials. But in the absence of proof pointing clearly elsewhere, Elliot remained the primary person of interest. His legal costs were mounting. Several of the firm's board members had already distanced themselves publicly. What Elliot wanted, Patricia said carefully, was to establish paternity before the investigation concluded. He had apparently learned through the same channels Nora imagined most things leaked about the pregnancy. "Why paternity?" Nora said. "Why now?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "The inheritance clause," she said. Nora set down her coffee cup. She listened while Patricia explained. Elliot's grandfather had left a trust. Not a small one, structured around a specific clause that tied a portion of the distribution to direct descendants. No children, no claim. One child had died in infancy. Elliot was the only remaining heir with standing to receive the balance of the trust, provided he could demonstrate the lineage. The trust was due to be administered within 18 months. The baby, in other words, was not what Elliot had suddenly decided he wanted. The baby was a legal instrument. Nora sat with this for the better part of a day. She went to work. She reviewed documents. She answered emails. She sat in a meeting about transit node placement, and did not say anything that wasn't reasonable and considered. She drove home through February gray and made dinner and washed the dishes, and stood at the window of her apartment looking at the parking lot below, and she let herself feel, very thoroughly, the specific shape of what Elliot Thorne had spent 9 years making her. Then she called Patricia back and told her they needed to talk about protective measures. What happened next was not simple and did not happen quickly. Patricia worked methodically and without drama. There were documents to file, processes to initiate, a family lawyer who worked alongside Patricia on the parental rights question. The distinction mattered. Elliot had not established paternity and could not demand it without a process that Nora had every right to manage carefully. The fact that he was under active investigation was noted carefully in the relevant filings. Fletcher found out, she told him, because by then she had started to trust him in the way she trusted very few people with the particular things she couldn't afford to carry alone. And he listened without making it about himself. He didn't offer to fix it. He asked what she needed. She told him she needed someone to help her think clearly. And he did that, for 2 hours on a Tuesday evening, in her small apartment, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, with both their coffee cups going cold, while they talked through the logistics of it. It was not a dramatic evening. It was one of the most important evenings of her life. She had the baby on a Friday morning in March. A girl. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Born at Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital with Trish on one side and her mother on the other. The labor was long enough to be exhausting and short enough to feel afterward like something that had happened at the exact right pace for what it was. She named her Rosalind. She did not tell Elliot she had delivered. She did not have to. Patricia handled the relevant notifications through the appropriate legal channels, which meant that Elliot knew, formally, what Elliot needed to know, and the rest was managed carefully by people whose job it was to manage things carefully. She brought Rosalind home to the apartment in Mississauga on a Sunday, and for the first several days, she did not do very much except feed her and hold her and look at her with the particular expression she suspected all new mothers wore. Somewhere between wonder and absolute disbelief that something this complete had been inside her body such a short time ago. Fletcher sent flowers, simple ones, yellow tulips, with a note in his own handwriting that said, "She's going to be remarkable, so will you." Nora read it twice and set it on the windowsill where she could see it from the rocking chair. The first time Elliot tried to access the hospital record, Patricia was informed within 24 hours. He had gone through his lawyer, who had gone through the appropriate channels, who had been met with the documentation Patricia had filed months earlier with considerable forethought. His lawyer pushed back. Patricia's response was unperturbed and extremely well organized. But the thing about Elliot, the thing Nora had understood for a while now, in the way you understand something you've been slow to name, was that he wasn't acting alone in this. The investigation had, over the months, quietly expanded its circle. The person who had used Elliot's credentials, who had restructured those internal accounts, who had left him precisely exposed enough to bear the consequences.
That person had a name, and the name was not one Nora had known until a Friday afternoon in April when Patricia called and said, with unusual evenness in her voice, that Nora might want to sit down. Cassandra Weir had worked in Elliot's building for 3 years.
She had access, professional, intimate, logistical, to almost everything he had access to. The digital forensics team that the firm had quietly retained over the winter had reconstructed, with considerable precision, a sequence of events that pointed clearly to a set of credentials used on 3 specific evenings when Elliot could be accounted for elsewhere. The IP addresses resolved. The session timestamps aligned to a device registered to Cassandra's home network. She had framed him, methodically. Beginning, the investigators believed, within the first 6 months of their relationship, which meant she had begun constructing the architecture of his destruction at approximately the same time he was constructing the architecture of Nora's. Nora absorbed this in the way she had learned to absorb large things, sitting still, hands in her lap, letting it move through her without grabbing at it. "Is this going to be prosecuted?" she asked. "That's not your decision," Patricia said, "and it's not mine either. But yes, I believe it will be." "Does this help him?" Nora said. "Legally." Patricia paused. "It clarifies the picture," she said. "It does not erase the family law filings." Nora had known Patricia long enough to know that that was a complete answer. What it meant, practically. Elliot would be exonerated of the embezzlement. The trust eventually would move toward distribution. His legal position had improved, but the process Nora had initiated, the protective filings, the managed framework around parental rights, the very deliberate structure of what Rosalind's life would look like and who would have access to it. None of that dissolved because Cassandra Weir had been arrested. Elliot's lawyer sent a letter in May. It was measured in tone and made reasonable-sounding arguments. Patricia's response was also measured and considerably longer, and contained a great deal of supporting documentation. There were 2 hearings, administrative, procedural, the kind that didn't appear in news coverage. Nora attended one of them and sat in a small room in a building in downtown Toronto and watched Elliot across a table for the first time since the divorce. He looked older. She wasn't surprised. He looked at her like he was trying to calculate something, and she thought, this is the version of him I should have seen earlier. This is the version that was always there. The mediator was a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Elaine Ostrowski, who had clearly sat through considerably more dramatic disputes than this one, and had the professional serenity to prove it. What emerged from the process, over 3 sessions, not one, was a structure that Nora's legal team had largely anticipated. Elliot had parental rights. What he did not have was the shape of access he'd wanted, and the trust clause, it turned out, had been interpreted more narrowly by the trust administrators than Elliot's lawyer had implied. He did not get what he came for. Whether that was justice or simply consequence, Nora wasn't sure she needed to decide. Summer arrived. Rosalind was 4 months old and had strong opinions about most things, including the direction she preferred to face in the carrier, the specific blanket she wanted at night, and the question of whether silence was preferable to the low hum of CBC Radio 1, which appeared to be, yes, strongly, as long as it was the morning programming. Nora went back to work part-time in June, from home mostly, with the kind of flexibility her firm had offered without her having to ask twice. The apartment had been reorganized to accommodate a small life. There were toys in places she'd never imagined having toys. There were things drying on the rack by the window that she'd never expected to be drying. Fletcher came to Toronto in June and in July. He didn't make anything complicated. He brought food from a restaurant he knew she liked. On both occasions, and he sat with Rosalind, and he sat on the floor and let her grab his finger with both hands, while he talked to Nora about the Etobicoke project and a new development proposal in Winnipeg and a podcast about municipal infrastructure that she'd recommended months earlier, and he had now listened to entirely. She watched him with her daughter and felt something settle in her chest. Not fully, not without questions still attached to it, but settle in the way of something that had been searching for its place and had begun to find it. "You're good with her," she said. He looked up. "She's easy to be good with," he said. "She's very direct about what she wants." "She gets that from me," Nora said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't feel like a performance. She had not yet told him what she felt. She wasn't sure the word felt was large enough for what was happening, which was more like a slow and gradual recognition. The way a city reveals itself not all at once but in increments, street by street, over the course of many months, until you realize you've stopped using the map. She told Trish in August. Trish did not say "I told you so," which Nora would have respected less. What Trish said was, "Are you happy?" And Nora sat with the question for a moment, the real weight of it, the way it felt after such a long year, after all of it, the papers on the kitchen island, the car in the driveway, the bathroom floor at Trish's apartment, the cold waiting rooms, the hearings, the January nights that had been so quiet she could hear her own breathing. "Yes," she said, "I think I actually am." The thing about starting over at 36, she had decided somewhere around month 5 of Rosalind's life, was that it bore no resemblance to starting over as people described it. It wasn't about a blank slate. There was no blank. Everything that had happened was still there, all of it. The 9 years, the divorce, the months of functioning while broken, the gradual architecture of something new built in the wreckage of something old. It was all present, all of it, stacked carefully in the specific person she had become. But you could build on that. You could build on almost anything. She'd learned if you were willing to stay in the room with it long enough. Rosalind was 6 months old when Fletcher asked. Simply and without ceremony, whether she'd be open to him being in her life, in their lives, as more than someone who appeared on a project site and sent books with playing card notes. Nora looked at him across her kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat with the divorce papers, the same table where they'd talked through the legal situation over cold coffee on a Tuesday in February, and she thought, this is how things actually change. Not in grand gestures, not in moments designed for the telling, in small, accumulated choices to keep showing up, until one day the showing up has a shape and a weight and a name. I'm open to it, she said, and she meant it all the way through. Cassandra Weir was charged formally in September. Elliot's name was cleared of the financial misconduct, though the trust administration moved more slowly than anyone had predicted, and was still unresolved by the time Nora had stopped tracking it closely. She had things that mattered more to track. The Etobicoke project broke ground in October. Nora was there for the ceremony. Not at the front, not behind a microphone, but in the line of consultants and planners who stood at the edge of the site in hard hats and watched the first equipment move. Fletcher was at the front, saying the appropriate things, shaking the appropriate hands. He caught her eye across the crowd and nodded, just once, the way people nod when they understand something that doesn't need saying. She nodded back. She drove home in the October light, the city spreading out around the 427 in that way it did in autumn. Wide and golden and improbably large, and in the back seat, Rosalind was asleep in the way that only babies sleep. Completely, without reservation, trusting entirely that the person driving knew where they were going. Nora did know. She hadn't always. But she did now. And for the first time in longer than she could name, that felt like enough.